It was the kind of summer where the nights felt endless and the air hung thick with heat. In towns like Waco, Texas, 1982 felt safe, or at least it looked that way. Teenagers spent evenings by the lake, windows were left open, and everyone believed they knew their neighbors. But sometimes, the most peaceful places hide the darkest secrets. And in the middle of that summer, three friends, Jill, Raylene, and Kenneth, unknowingly walked straight into one of the most haunting stories Texas would ever tell. Before I ever knew their names, I remember standing by a lake of my own, years later, feeling that same calm that tricks you into thinking the world is harmless. My story doesn't involve blood or handcuffs, but it began with the same kind of illusion, believing that danger was something that only happened to other people, somewhere far away. I grew up thinking that the worst things in life came with a warning, that evil had a sound or a shadow that gave it away. It doesn't. Sometimes it's just a quiet night, a few friends, and a place that feels safe until it isn't. That's why the Lake Waco story always struck me. Waco wasn't a big city full of crime and noise. It was small, steady, and predictable. The kind of town where people waved at each other in grocery store parking lots and where a police siren was rare enough to make everyone step outside. That summer, the lake was the town's escape, a place where young people went to swim, laugh, and forget about the weight of growing up. Jill Montgomery, 17, was the kind of girl people described as kind-hearted, always smiling. Her best friend Raylene Rice, also 17, had that mix of confidence and curiosity that makes youth so magnetic. And Kenneth Franks, 18, the oldest of the three, was easygoing, the quiet leader of their small circle. When they set out that warm August night, it was supposed to be nothing more than another summer adventure. A few hours under the stars, talking about life, dreams, maybe even love. No one could have guessed it would be their last. What makes this story even more haunting is how ordinary that evening must have felt. The laughter, the sound of the water against the rocks, the crickets in the grass. All those small, comforting sounds that make you feel safe. Until the silence that followed. Looking back, I think that's what chills me most. How fragile that feeling of safety really is. My own experience, different as it may be, taught me that danger doesn't always arrive with warning signs. It creeps in quietly, unnoticed, until it's too late to stop it. That's what happened at Lake Waco. A night of innocence turned into one of Texas's darkest crimes, and the town would never look at the lake the same way again. The summer of 1982 began like any other, but by the time it ended, Waco had lost more than three young lives. It lost its sense of peace, and maybe a part of its soul. That August evening was warm, still, and deceptively calm. The kind of night that felt made for freedom. Jill Montgomery, Raylene Rice, and Kenneth Franks didn't plan anything extraordinary. Just a drive, a few laughs, maybe a swim under the stars. For teenagers in Waco, Lake Waco was the place to go when you wanted to breathe, when you needed to feel like the world was bigger than the same streets you saw every day. I've often thought about that, how small choices, the simplest plans, can change everything. I remember nights like that from my own youth. The ones that start with a friend's car pulling up, headlights cutting through the dark, music spilling out of rolled down windows. You don't think about danger. You think about how alive you feel. That's what makes stories like this one so personal to me. They remind you how thin the line is between ordinary and tragic. Jill had borrowed her stepfather's car that night. The plan was easy. Pick up Raylene and Kenneth, drive out to the lake, and hang out for a while. No curfew worries, no one expecting trouble. Jill was responsible, the kind of person parents trusted. Kenneth and Raylene were her close friends, comfortable with each other, familiar with the winding back roads that led to Cone Park, a quiet spot by Lake Waco where teenagers often gathered. But sometime between the laughter and the stillness of the water, something went wrong. When the sun came up the next morning, their families knew something wasn't right. Jill's stepfather noticed the car was gone. Calls went unanswered. Hours later, the Waco police got a call. A fisherman had spotted something unusual near the lake's edge. The discovery was every parent's nightmare. Jill, Raylene, and Kenneth were found bound, gagged, and brutally murdered. The brutality of the scene stunned everyone. It wasn't random violence. It was calculated, controlled, and cruel. The teenagers' bodies bore signs of torture, suggesting they had suffered before their deaths. It was hard to believe something so horrific could happen in such a familiar place. I can't help but picture the quiet that must have followed, the hum of police radios, the shocked whispers of onlookers, the disbelief on the faces of neighbors who had always believed their town was safe. There's something almost sacred about the places where we go to feel free, the lakes, the parks, the roads that hold our memories. When something evil happens there, it poisons the way you remember them. Lake Waco wasn't just a body of water anymore. It was a crime scene that would haunt Texas for decades. In the days that followed, grief and fear spread faster than the news itself. Parents who once trusted their kids to be out after dark now kept them home. The town, once full of laughter and light summer nights, became heavy with suspicion. Everyone wanted answers, and fast. That's the danger of silence after tragedy. The need for justice grows louder than the facts. And as Waco would soon learn, that rush to find someone to blame can sometimes lead to mistakes that can't be undone. When news of the murders spread through Waco, panic settled in like a storm cloud that wouldn't move. This was a town that had never seen something like this before. Not three teenagers found bound, gagged, and brutally murdered by the same lake where families picnicked on weekends. Within hours, fear replaced routine. Parents started picking up their kids from school early. People began double locking their doors, something most had never bothered to do. Even casual conversations at the grocery store turned to whispers about what could have happened that night. I've seen what fear does to a community. It changes people. It makes every stranger look suspicious, every noise sound dangerous. When I was younger, something happened in my neighborhood, not nearly as brutal, but enough to shake us. For weeks, everyone was on edge. Kids weren't allowed out after dark. The smallest rumor spread like wildfire. Looking back, I remember how quickly fear turned into blame. And that's what began to happen in Waco. The police were under tremendous pressure. The local papers were printing bold headlines. The families of Jill, Raylene, and Kenneth wanted answers, and they deserved them. Reporters camped outside police headquarters, pressing for updates. The community demanded justice. But in that kind of atmosphere, justice and speed often collide. Every day that passed without an arrest felt like another failure, another insult to the grieving families. Investigators worked around the clock, combing through the area, searching for clues. The crime scene offered few. No clear fingerprints, no murder weapon, and no eyewitnesses. Just evidence of unimaginable violence. The bindings, the gags, and the location told them the crime had been planned, but by who? Rumors began filling the silence that the evidence couldn't explain. Some said it was a cult. Others whispered about drug deals gone wrong or revenge. As time passed, more theories emerged, and law enforcement grew increasingly desperate to narrow them down. The Waco Police Department, along with the MC Lennon County Sheriff's Office, started questioning locals, ex-cons, and anyone who had been near the lake that night. But the lack of answers only deepened the tension. The families were drowning in grief. Jill's mother described her daughter as full of life, always ready to help others. Kenneth's family struggled to understand how their son, who had never been in trouble, could end up like that. Raylene's parents avoided the lake entirely. What used to be a calm, happy place was now a symbol of everything that had been stolen from them. And while the community mourned, the authorities were beginning to feel something else, the sting of expectation. This wasn't just about solving a crime anymore. It was about restoring peace, proving that Waco was still safe, that justice could be swift and sure. But history has shown that when investigators are under pressure to produce answers, mistakes can be made. And sometimes, those mistakes cost more lives than they save. By the end of that summer, Waco wasn't just a small Texas town anymore. It had become a headline. The search for the truth had begun. But so had something more dangerous, the rush to find someone to blame. The investigation into the Lake Waco murders began with urgency, but quickly turned into frustration. Detectives scoured the area for days, retracing the victims' last movements, interviewing anyone who might have seen or heard something that night. The scene at Cone Park offered more questions than answers. Tire tracks were found, but they led nowhere. The victims' clothes, bindings, and gags gave little forensic information by the standards of 1982. There were signs of torture and sexual assault, but not enough evidence to point clearly to anyone. In those early days, investigators hoped the case would break open with a single lead, maybe a witness who heard screams, or a local who noticed something off. But nothing came. The water had washed away potential clues, and the August heat made preserving evidence difficult. The more they searched, the more it became clear. Whoever had done this had planned carefully and left little behind. I've often thought about how frustrating that must have been, standing in the middle of a crime scene, surrounded by silence, feeling like you're staring straight at evil but can't see its face. It reminds me of times in my own life when I knew something was wrong but couldn't prove it. The helplessness, The gap between what you know and what you can prove can make even good people desperate. And desperation is dangerous in an investigation. As days turned into weeks, the police cast a wider net. They interviewed hundreds of people: fishermen, teenagers, ex-cons, and anyone known to hang around the lake after dark. They followed every rumor, every lead that seemed even remotely possible. Nothing stuck. The case file grew thicker, but the truth stayed buried. Detectives began to feel the weight of a community's anger and fear pressing down on them. Then came the first small break, or at least what looked like one. Someone reported seeing a suspicious car near the lake that night. Others mentioned hearing loud noises in the distance, though no one could pinpoint exactly when. Those fragments of information fueled theories, but not facts. Investigators began developing a profile: multiple attackers, likely men, familiar with the area. The brutality suggested personal rage, not random violence. Yet none of the victims had known enemies. That confusion pushed detectives to start looking closer at people with criminal pasts, anyone who might have had a motive or history of violence. Waco wasn't a big city, and names started circulating quickly. Still, without solid physical evidence, every guess felt like reaching in the dark. Meanwhile, the community's patience was running out. The pressure on law enforcement intensified. The media called the case the Lake Waco murders, and every newscast reopened the wound. Each unanswered question fed public anger. People wanted results, not theories, not possibilities, but names. Inside the police department, the mood had shifted from methodical to frantic. Leads that should have been dismissed were suddenly treated as breakthroughs. Detectives began focusing less on whether a suspect fit the evidence and more on whether the stories sounded convincing. That's often how wrongful convictions begin, not with bad intentions, but with desperation. The Lake Waco investigation was at that breaking point. The truth was still out there, but it was about to be buried under pressure, politics, and the need to tell a grieving town that justice was on the way. The first real suspect to emerge in the Lake Waco investigation was a man named David Wayne Spence, a name that would soon divide Waco and define the case for years to come. Spence was 27, rough around the edges, and already known to local police for small-time crimes. He lived not far from the area and spent most of his time with friends who had reputations just as bad as his. To investigators desperate for a lead, he seemed to fit. He was familiar with the lake, he had a criminal record, and he wasn't the type anyone in town would rush to defend. But how Spence came into the picture wasn't through solid evidence, it was through rumor. In late 1982, the name David Spence began surfacing during informal interviews with inmates and local troublemakers. Someone mentioned he had bragged about hurting people. Another said he hung around a convenience store owned by a man named Muneer Deeb, who had a temper and a few enemies of his own. None of it was confirmed, but to detectives under pressure, it sounded promising. Deeb owned a small convenience store called the Rainbow Drive-In. He was a Lebanese immigrant trying to make a living, but he was also outspoken, often clashing with people in town. He had recently taken out a life insurance policy on one of his employees, a young woman named Gail Kelly, and investigators found that curious. It didn't take long before they began to wonder if that policy might connect to the Lake murders. Here's where the theories started to take shape. Maybe Deeb wanted Gail dead for the insurance money. Maybe he paid someone to do it. Maybe Spence was that someone, and maybe, in a tragic mistake, he and his friends killed the wrong people that night. Jill Montgomery, investigators believed, resembled Gail Kelly. To them, it explained everything: the randomness of the crime, the brutality, and the connection between Spence and Deeb. But there was a problem. None of it was backed by evidence. No physical proof tied Spence to the murders. No witness saw him near the lake that night. The only thing linking him to the crime was talk, whispers from jailhouse informants, and speculations from detectives who needed the story to fit. I think about that sometimes, how easily a person's life can turn with one rumor. I've seen people judged, not because of what they've done, but because of what others decide to believe. Once your name gets tied to something dark, it's almost impossible to pull it back. That's what happened to Spence. By late 1983, the Waco Police and the M.C. Lennon County Sheriff's Office had built what looked like a case. They connected Spence to two brothers, Tony and Gilbert Melendez, who also had criminal records and were known to hang around with him. Together, they became the perfect villains for a community that needed someone to blame. The theory grew legs. Deeb ordered the hit. Spence and the Melendez brothers carried it out, and the three teenagers were victims of mistaken identity. To the public, it made sense. To the families, it offered closure. To the investigators, it meant relief. But beneath the surface, cracks were already forming. None of the suspects confessed. No DNA or fingerprints placed them at the scene. And the more you looked at the story, the less it held together. Still, in a small town desperate for justice, those doubts didn't matter. The case had its villains, and that was enough to move forward. What no one realized then was that the decision to focus on David Spence would shape the case and the failures of the justice system for decades to come. Once investigators had their suspects, the story began to take a shape that sounded almost cinematic. They claimed it was a murder-for-hire plot gone wrong, a scheme that started inside a small convenience store and ended in the brutal deaths of 3 innocent teenagers. According to the theory, store owner Muneer Deeb had paid David Wayne Spence, along with Tony and Gilbert Melendez, to kill one of his employees, Gail Kelly, in exchange for a payout from a $25,000 life insurance policy. But instead of killing the intended target, the men supposedly mistook Jill Montgomery for Gail because the 2 young women had similar features. On paper, it almost fit. It gave a motive, a reason for the violence, and a neat connection between the suspects. The story tied everything together, too neatly, in fact. What it didn't have was evidence. There were no fingerprints, no fibers, no DNA, and no eyewitnesses linking Spence or the Melendez brothers to the murders. What it did have was a web of jailhouse informants, all eager to talk, each with their own reasons for doing so. If you've ever watched how desperation shapes truth, you know how dangerous that can be. I've seen people bend stories to survive, say what someone wants to hear just to get out of trouble. That's what began happening here. Several inmates claimed Spence had confessed to them in jail, boasting about the murders in graphic detail. But those confessions all shared one problem. They didn't line up with the actual evidence. Still, prosecutors embraced them. A story that felt complete was better than one that felt uncertain. Deeb, who was arrested alongside Spence and the Melendez brothers, denied everything. He insisted the insurance policy was a common business precaution, not a murder plot. He had no reason to hurt Gail, and certainly no reason to target 3 teenagers he had never met. But Deeb's personality didn't help him. He was argumentative, proud, and foreign in a town that wasn't always kind to outsiders. To many in Waco, that alone made him suspicious. Meanwhile, Spence insisted on his innocence too. He admitted he'd done plenty wrong in life, but not this. He said he didn't even know Jill, Raylene, or Kenneth. Yet, his reputation, rough, reckless, and criminal, made him an easy man to believe guilty. It was easier to see him as the monster the headlines needed. The investigation leaned hard into the narrative. Detectives painted Spence as the violent enforcer, Tony and Gilbert as his reckless accomplices, and Deeb as the scheming mastermind pulling the strings from behind the counter of his store. Together, they formed the perfect villains for the town's tragedy, and in the absence of real proof, the story itself became the evidence. That's one of the quiet lessons buried in this case. How the need to make sense of horror can sometimes lead us to invent sense where there is none. The human mind hates not knowing. And in 1983, Waco needed answers more than it needed accuracy. By the time the case reached prosecutors, the theory had hardened into fact. They had a motive, a narrative, and witnesses willing to swear that Spence confessed. It didn't matter that some of those witnesses later admitted they'd been promised leniency, money, or parole for their cooperation. What mattered was that the community could finally see progress. The headlines shifted. The fear that had once filled Waco now turned into anger, and that anger was focused squarely on Spence and his co-defendants. The murder-for-hire story became the backbone of the trials that followed. It gave the illusion of justice, but as time would show, it was built on shaky ground, and every word of it would eventually be questioned. The trials that followed were as dramatic as they were tragic. By 1984, David Wayne Spence, Tony Melendez, and Gilbert Melendez were facing capital murder charges for the Lake Waco killings. Muneer Deeb was charged as the alleged mastermind, the man who had supposedly paid them to carry out the murders. For a town that had spent nearly 2 years trapped in fear and outrage, the courtroom became a stage where justice finally looked possible. But beneath the surface, the foundation of the case was already cracked. The prosecution's case rested almost entirely on circumstantial evidence and jailhouse testimony. They had no physical evidence connecting the men to the crime scene, no fingerprints, no hair, no weapon. What they had instead were the words of inmates who claimed Spence had confessed while in jail. These informants described the crime in disturbing detail, details they said only the killer would know. but many of those details were already public through news reports, and others were inconsistent or outright false. Still, the prosecutors leaned into emotion. They showed photos of the victims, reminded the jury of the community's pain, and painted Spence as a violent, remorseless man capable of unthinkable cruelty. The Melendez brothers were portrayed as his eager followers, and Deeb as the calculating puppet master who pulled the strings. It was a story that made sense, even if the facts didn't. I've seen how people can become characters in a story they never agreed to be part of. Once the public decides who the villain is, truth becomes almost irrelevant. I think that's what happened to Spence. He was already branded guilty long before he ever walked into court. His rough past, his temper, and his reputation made him the perfect target for a town desperate to move on. The jury didn't take long. In 1984, both Tony and Gilbert Melendez were convicted and sentenced to life in prison. Spence's trial came next, and despite his protests of innocence, the verdict was the same: guilty. He was sentenced to death. The courtroom erupted with a mix of relief and applause. Families of the victims wept, believing justice had finally been served. The community, too, breathed easier, convinced the nightmare was over. Then came the trial of Muneer Deeb. Prosecutors accused him of orchestrating the entire plot, hiring Spence and the Melendez brothers to kill his employee for insurance money. He, too, was convicted and sentenced to death. For a brief time, it seemed the case had reached its end. The killers were behind bars, the town was avenged, and the Lake Waco murders were solved. But cracks soon began to appear. Some of the jailhouse informants who testified against Spence and the others started changing their stories. A few admitted they had lied to get lighter sentences or other favors. One even confessed that investigators had fed him details about the crime. Defense attorneys raised questions about the lack of forensic evidence, the contradictory testimonies, and the inconsistencies in the prosecution's timeline. Despite these doubts, the convictions stood. The justice system, once in motion, rarely turns back. For Waco, it didn't matter that the evidence was weak. What mattered was closure. But for the men convicted, especially David Spence, it meant the beginning of a long, painful fight for truth. In the years that followed, appeals would be filed, witnesses would recant, and journalists would begin to uncover troubling flaws in the case. Yet none of that could undo what had already been done. The story of the Lake Waco murders had its ending, but as it turned out, it wasn't the right one. As the years passed, the story that once seemed so clear began to unravel. The Lake Waco murders, once considered solved, started to look more like a warning, a lesson in how easily justice can go wrong when built on pressure, fear, and weak evidence. It started with small cracks. A witness recanted here, and inconsistencies surfaced there. Then slowly, those cracks widened until the entire case began to collapse under its own weight. By the early 1990s, journalists and legal advocates were digging deeper. Among them was a local reporter who had covered the case from the beginning and couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. He started going through transcripts, police reports, and interview notes, and what he found was disturbing. Many of the jailhouse informants who helped convict David Spence and the Melendez brothers had later admitted they were pressured or promised deals in exchange for testimony. Some said investigators told them exactly what to say. Others claimed they were threatened with harsher sentences if they refused to cooperate. When you strip a case down to its bones, what you're left with is either truth or fabrication. In the Lake Waco murders, the line between the two had been blurred beyond recognition. The so-called murder-for-hire plot started to sound more like a theory than fact. No physical evidence had ever tied Spence or the Melendez brothers to the crime scene. The insurance policy that prosecutors said was Deeb's motive turned out to be common practice among small business owners. And key witnesses who had testified so confidently at trial later admitted they were unsure or had lied altogether. Even the timeline of the crime was shaky. Some witnesses said Spence couldn't have been near the lake when the murders happened. Others recalled seeing him miles away that night. Yet, none of those details were fully explored in court. Once the narrative took hold, that Spence was the killer, everything that didn't fit was quietly ignored. It reminds me of how easy it is for people to see what they want to see once they've made up their minds. I've seen it in everyday life, when someone's reputation replaces reality. Once you're labeled as something, whether guilty or untrustworthy, people stop looking for the truth. That's what happened to Spence. Over time, evidence emerged that could have changed everything. Forensic experts reviewed the bite marks on one of the victims, marks prosecutors had used as proof that Spence was the attacker. Later analysis showed the marks didn't match him at all. In fact, some experts said it was impossible to even link them conclusively to any individual. Back in 1982, that kind of forensic science didn't have the precision it does today. But those early claims carried enormous weight in court. Meanwhile, Muneer Deeb, who had been sentenced to death, finally won an appeal. His conviction was overturned after courts found serious flaws in the evidence and witness credibility. At his retrial, he was acquitted on all charges and walked free. The man once branded as the mastermind of the Lake Waco murders was now exonerated. But for David Spence, the clock was still ticking. By the mid-1990s, more people were beginning to believe he might be innocent. Reporters published investigations questioning the convictions. Even some former law enforcement officers started to doubt whether they had arrested the right men. Yet, despite the growing doubt, Spence's appeals were denied. It's painful to think about how truth sometimes comes too late. The Lake Waco case had become a machine that couldn't stop. Even when new evidence suggested it had gone off track, the system had done what it was designed to do: convict and punish, but not what it was supposed to do: find the truth. What began as a story about justice was turning into one about failure, one that would haunt Texas for years to come. On April 3, 1997, inside the walls of the Texas State Penitentiary in Huntsville, David Wayne Spence was led to the execution chamber. He was 40 years old. 15 years had passed since the night at Lake Waco, and in that time, he had gone from being a drifter with a record to one of Texas's most notorious convicted murderers. The media described him as defiant until the end. But those who were there said something different, that he was calm, almost resigned. Just before the lethal injection began, Spence looked through the glass at the witnesses and said, "I'm innocent." Then he closed his eyes. Minutes later, he was gone. That moment was supposed to bring closure to Waco, the final chapter of a story that had haunted the town since 1982. For the families of Jill Montgomery, Raylene Rice, and Kenneth Franks, it was a day they had waited years for. They believed justice had been served. But for others, journalists, attorneys, and even some former police officers, the execution felt like a mistake that couldn't be undone. Because by then, serious questions about Spence's guilt had become impossible to ignore. In the years leading up to his death, multiple witnesses who had testified against Spence recanted. One by one, they admitted to lying, some saying they were coached or threatened. Others said they were offered reduced sentences or privileges in exchange for their cooperation. The bite mark evidence that prosecutors once touted as proof was now discredited, and the supposed motive, that Spence had been hired to kill the wrong person, had completely fallen apart. The insurance policy that sparked the entire theory had long since been deemed irrelevant, and Muneer Deeb, the alleged mastermind, had been acquitted years earlier. If you look at it all now, the story doesn't add up. It never really did. The murders were real. The pain was real. But the men held responsible, at least some of them, may not have been. Spence spent more than a decade proclaiming his innocence, and even people who once doubted him began to listen. Journalists like Patricia Bernstein and others who re-examined the case found glaring inconsistencies, missing evidence, suppressed reports, and conflicting witness statements that should have raised red flags. I think about that often, how justice can be absolute in its punishment, but uncertain in its truth. I once believed the justice system was designed to protect the innocent and punish the guilty. But cases like this show how easily that line can blur when public pressure, media attention, and human error mix together. Once a story like Spence's takes hold, undoing it becomes nearly impossible. The legal process doesn't move with emotion, even when emotion is what created the mistake in the first place. After Spence's execution, the conversation around the Lake Waco murders shifted. Instead of celebrating closure, people began asking hard questions. How did a man with no physical evidence against him end up on death row? Why were so many unreliable witnesses used? And how could a man allegedly hired for a killing mistake 3 innocent teenagers for one intended target? The truth is, by 1997, it didn't matter what was real. The state had decided, the courts had upheld it, and the needle had done its job. But long after the execution, doubts refused to die. To this day, many believe David Spence may have been innocent, that he died not as a killer, but as the victim of a system that mistook speed for justice. Waco eventually moved on, as towns do. The headlines faded. The lake grew quiet again. But for those who studied the case, the echo of that night and the choices that followed never truly disappeared. Spence's death didn't end the story. It became the evidence that justice, once rushed, can never truly be trusted without truth behind it. In the years that followed David Spence's execution, Waco tried to heal, but the wounds left behind never fully closed. For some, the Lake Waco murders were a story about unimaginable loss, 3 young lives cut short for no reason anyone could truly explain. For others, it became a cautionary tale about justice gone wrong, about how desperation to solve a crime can lead to another kind of tragedy, the possible execution of an innocent man. As the 2000s rolled in, new generations heard about the case not from the headlines, but through documentaries, investigative books, and late-night conversations between people who still couldn't shake the feeling that something about it didn't fit. Reporters and researchers who dug into the files found contradictions everywhere. DNA evidence that could have confirmed guilt or innocence was either destroyed or lost. Testimonies were inconsistent, and crucial reports never made it into trial records. Over time, the case became something bigger than just one murder investigation. It became an example used in criminal justice programs, law classes, and ethics discussions across Texas and beyond. Professors cited it when talking about confirmation bias, showing how once investigators believe they found their suspect, every piece of evidence can be twisted to fit that narrative. Defense attorneys studied it to show the dangers of jailhouse informants, how easily people behind bars can be influenced by promises of freedom or revenge. Even those within law enforcement began to reflect. A few retired officers quietly admitted that mistakes were made. Some spoke out, saying that the rush to find answers after the murders blinded them to possibilities they didn't want to see. Others still defend the conviction, believing that while the evidence was thin, the story made sense in the chaos of the time. I think the most haunting part of this entire case is what it says about truth, how fragile it is, how easily it bends under pressure. The Lake Waco murders remind us that justice isn't just about punishing someone for a crime. It's about making sure that punishment belongs to the right person. The system failed there, not because it wanted to, but because people were human, flawed, emotional, and desperate to give a grieving town an answer. And when you look at it that way, the Lake Waco story becomes more than a piece of true crime history. It becomes a mirror. It forces us to ask uncomfortable questions. How often does this happen? How many cases were solved on bad evidence? How many names went to the grave carrying guilt that wasn't theirs? Today, the case stands as both a warning and a lesson. It teaches that real justice demands patience, humility, and accountability, qualities often lost in the noise of public outrage. The Lake Waco murders began as a tragedy of violence, but they ended as a tragedy of human error. And maybe that's what makes it endure. Because in telling this story, we're not just remembering 3 innocent teenagers or a man who may have died for their deaths. We're acknowledging something deeper, that truth, once buried beneath fear and haste, can stay hidden for decades. But as long as people keep questioning, keep asking, and keep looking closer, there's still a chance to learn from it. That's what this story really is. Not a tale of murder or mystery, but of accountability, the kind that doesn't stop with a conviction or an execution. The kind that makes us look at our system and ourselves and ask if we're truly doing justice or just trying to feel like we are.